And this morning, we'll continue our study. We're looking at Matthew chapter 26 and chapter 27. And this morning, we're going to be looking at a story that's given rise to the observance of what we've come to know as the Lord's Supper. Listen to a few verses, chapter 26, verses 17 to 19. On the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want to make preparation for you to eat the Passover?" He replied, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, 'The teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate Passover with my disciples at your house.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. For 1,500 years, the Passover had been teaching God's people how much they need God and how great a salvation God had provided for them. This sacred observance looks back to God's deliverance of the Israelites from the slavery of Egypt and the plague of death on all the firstborn in that land. It was a very strange meal, a very unusual meal, a meal of strange recipes and flavors. Salt water to remind people of the tears of slavery. Bitter herbs like horseradish, so people would remember the sour flavor of bondage. A fruit paste with cinnamon sticks to remind them of making bricks out of clay and straw. A meal of lamb to remind them of how the lamb was killed for every household and its blood sprinkled on the doorpost, signaling the angel of death, "You pass over this house." Flat bread made without yeast to remind God's people both that they are to be holy, no yeast-like sin puffing up in their hearts, and that they must be ready to travel, to move quickly. That kind of bread wouldn't spoil as they traveled. And then there were 4 cups of wine taken throughout the meal. The custom was drawn, of course, from 4 promises made by God to Israel way back in Exodus, chapter 6, verses 6 to 7. There's a free sermon outline there if you have to preach some Sunday when I'm away. Listen to what it says. "I will bring you out. I will make you free from being slaves. I will redeem you. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God." The Passover was significant to Jesus because it introduces to his disciples the way that God had worked among his people and gave him an opportunity to redefine it, to say, this is how God is going to work among his people. It reminded them that sin is a life of bondage, just like the Israelites had been subjected to in Egypt. It reminded them that sin's slavery is like making endless bricks out of clay. It reminded them that death will pass over every house, and our only protection lies not in our heritage or in our might, but in the blood of a sacrificial lamb. It reminded them that God is a redeeming God, that he's buying people out of slavery. It reminded them that he is a liberating God, that he's setting people free, that he's sending them safe and sound toward a land that he's prepared for them, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of promise. Now, because of TV and social media and our frenetic schedules, families don't spend much time eating together anymore, except maybe in noisy restaurants. But it's interesting to notice that the Israelites learned their theology at a table. And Jesus wanted to teach his disciples that the Passover was but an appetizer for the feast of salvation that he was about to bring to the world. So he brings his disciples to the Passover meal on the eve of his death to remind them of an even greater salvation that is to come to them. And he wants them to be spiritually hungry for that salvation that he's going to bring to them. Listen to verse 31. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." What a strange feast, this Passover meal. A feast that drives one guest away, that leaves all the others unsettled and confused, and that leaves the host himself with a broken heart. What a meal. Jesus does not redefine this Passover meal to be a safe meal. It's anything but. Now, we don't practice the Lord's Supper or communion in the Salvation Army. It's actually not clear, at least to me, from the text that Jesus is actually instituting anything that resembles what we now know as the sacrament of the Last Supper. Especially when there are congregations that exclude other Christians because they don't belong to that denomination. I have trouble reconciling that. Jesus is in fact sharing a final meal with his disciples that radically redefines the Passover and expands its significance way beyond Israel. And I want to suggest perhaps even way beyond what we've now come to practice in the church today. I think what he's doing is much deeper than the Passover, and it's much deeper than what we now call the Lord's Supper. It's our belief in the Salvation Army that every meal should be an occasion to remember the sacrificial death of Jesus, and that our very lives should be sacramental in nature. I like the way General Shaw Clifton puts it in his book, Who Are These Salvationists? He said, please remember that as Salvationists, we are non-sacramentalist, but we are not non-sacramental. I had an opportunity to sit with General Shaw Clifton while we were waiting for a flight into Haiti. We were sitting in the airport in Miami, and I said, can you unpack that a little for me? And I had the privilege of listening to him unpack that. And he made reference, as I want to General Albert Osborne. And he said, General Osborne captures what I mean beautifully. He said, my life must be Christ's broken bread. My love, his outpoured wine. A cup or filled, a table spread beneath his name and sign, that other souls, refreshed and fed, now listen, may share his life through mine. We have a deep respect for what Jesus did that night. And as Salvationists, we do not speak disparagingly of those who celebrate it as a sacrament. But ours is a call for a deeper application that includes remembrance and thanks at every meal and an accompanying sacramental lifestyle. It's unfortunate that such a sacred ceremony, as with many of the ceremonies of the Salvation Army, I might say, is so often taken with so little thought and with so little intentionality, and sometimes even with a great deal of pretense. We must respect what Jesus is doing here, and we must honor it in our daily lives, whether we practice the communion or don't practice the communion. We have to get our minds around what Jesus is doing here, and it has to become a part of who we are. When Jesus redefines the Passover, which is what I think he's doing here, he shows us that pretenders cannot hide from the Lord's judgment. They cannot hide from the Lord's judgment at any time, and for sure, they cannot hide from the Lord's judgment at the Lord's Supper. Jesus was able to look into the hearts of everyone, of course, and as he looked into the heart of Judas, he saw what no one else could see. He saw the heart of a betrayer and a liar who wanted to celebrate Passover with him. In 1 Corinthians 11, verses 27 to 32, Paul issues a solemn warning that this is not a meal to be trifled with. It is not a meal to be taken in an unworthy manner. It is not a meal to be taken with pretense. Paul says it can literally kill you. Now, that doesn't mean that sinners can't eat at this meal or the table would be empty. What it does mean is that betrayers need to be wary. That fakes and frauds who eat this meal should know that they're eating poison. Just as fakes and frauds who say that they are called to live a sacramental lifestyle but don't do so also eat poison and are in danger of judgment. The Last Supper challenges us to allow the Lord to examine our hearts. The disciples were shocked to learn that a betrayer was amongst them. Isn't it interesting that it also prompted all of them to ask, "Surely not I, Lord." Or as the NLT translation puts it, "I'm not the one, am I, Lord?" And I'm sure they all expected Jesus immediately to say, "No, not you, and not you, not you, not you," until he'd come to Judas. But of course, he doesn't seem to reply. And when they all say, "Is it me, Lord?" Jesus doesn't respond. Because while only one of them would betray him, in reality, they were all about to forsake him. He eventually told them as much in verse 31. "This very night, you will all fall away on account of me." John tells us that these disciples moved very quickly from saying, "Surely, Lord, not me," to an argument about which one of them was greatest in the kingdom. There's a sense in which this meal was intended to bring out the worst in us, not to provide us with bad behavior, but to shine a light on our fickle hearts, and to illuminate what only God himself can see within us. This Holy Week of great suffering for Jesus begins around the table, begins with his friends. We often think the suffering began when they came in the garden and took him away with clubs and spears and torches. I think it began around that table with friends. This must have been an incredibly difficult meal for Jesus. And it's easy for us to miss some of the details. Take a look at verse 23, for example. Jesus says, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl will betray me." And immediately our minds go to Judas. But in fact, every one of the disciples had dipped their hand into the bowl. It was a bowl of fruit paste. And when that part of the meal came around, they all dipped their bread into the fruit paste. That's what friends did. And Jesus is saying, my betrayer is one of my most intimate friends. Don't miss the fact, too, that Jesus was the host of this meal. It was absolutely imperative in that Jewish culture that no one speaks negatively about the host, much less betrays him. It's difficult to understand why the plan of God needed to include a betrayal by Judas. Couldn't Jesus have been arrested and crucified without a turncoat? And as I got to thinking about that, I wondered, is it possible that in order for Jesus to drink the full cup of human suffering and pain, The betrayal of a dear and trusted friend had to be a part of it. Have you never felt the disappointment and pain of being betrayed by someone you loved, someone you trusted? It was a heartache that David foretold in one of his Psalms, Psalm 41, verse 9. He said, even my close friend, whom I trusted, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. Don't forget that Jesus loved Judas as much as he loved any of the others. Have you ever stopped to think about the kind of people that were invited to this meal? Not the kind of people you want to invite home for lunch after the service, probably. There was one who would betray him, and a whole bunch of others who would forsake him. Jesus didn't have to dine with such a motley crew as this. But the meal exposed each and every heart around the table. But most beautifully, perhaps, it exposes the heart of Christ, who finds fellowship even with the likes of us. I don't know that there's any other passage of Scripture with which we're more familiar than these next verses, which I suspect is the way Jesus would have it to be. Verses 26 to 29. While they were eating, Jesus took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, drink of it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of the fruit of this vine from now on until the day when I drink of it with you in my Father's kingdom. In fulfilling and redefining the Passover, Jesus provides you and me with manna for our deepest hunger. You see, we hunger for food that will sustain us all the way through our lives. And his broken body becomes food for our journey. Bread made without yeast is a biblical symbol of holiness. Yeast being an image of all that puffs up and ultimately destroys and spoils. Jesus is for us like dining on holiness. He's food for our souls that never spoils, that strengthens us, that fills us with righteousness and grace and peace and hope and all the other fruit of the Spirit. God told the Israelites to make unleavened bread so that they'd have food for their journey out of bondage to freedom. It was bread that would last and not spoil. It was perfect for pilgrims. It was a forerunner of manna. That's what Jesus is for us. He's food for our journey to the land of God's promises. Food for all those wildernesses that we will inevitably pass through on our journey to the place that he's gone to prepare for us. Isn't it an interesting name, the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Who but God would make a feast out of unleavened bread? But that's what Jesus is for us. He's a feast of unleavened bread. Because we hunger for God, Jesus poured out forgiveness and seals our covenant with God. As it says in verses 27 to 28, then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, drink from it. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus is taking the disciples again all the way back to Exodus chapter 24, verses 6 to 7, when Moses secured Israel's commitment to God's old covenant. Moses took half of the blood and poured it into bowls. The other half he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." And so once again, blood would be shed and a covenant established between God and his people. But this time a covenant would be written on their hearts, and it would be purchased with the blood of God's own Son. This cup was the third of the 4 Passover cups. It was called the cup of redemption, and it celebrates God's promise. "I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment." Who would have ever guessed that God's mighty act of judgment would be pronounced against his own Son, so that redemption could be purchased for his people from every tribe, from every nation, from every kindred, from every tongue? Because we hunger for hope, Jesus redefines the Passover meal to be the promise of eternity with Christ. Many believe that Jesus had the 4th cup in mind when he spoke verse 29. "I tell you, I will not drink of the fruit of this vine from now on until the day that I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." The 4th cup, you'll remember, marked God's promise. "I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God." Down through the centuries until this day, the Passover liturgy continues to use words like these. "This year we eat it in the land of bondage. Next year in the land of promise." It's that promise that sustains us, that feeds our deepest hunger for hope. You see, friends, slowly God is gathering his family home. What happens when we remember what Jesus did as we share every meal and as we live our lives in a sacramental manner is much more than a memorial. It's much more than a ritual. It's much more than a routine. It's like sharing a meal that's rich with the ancient recipes of God's given grace and freedom. It's like sharing a meal that lays bare the secrets of our hearts. It's coming to a place where we know that God sees the inner recesses of our hearts. He sees what no one else sees, and we're okay with that, because we know that his grace is great, and that he loves to forgive our sins, and that he's preparing a place that he's going to take us to one day. And it's like sharing a meal that, in some mysterious way beyond our understanding, brings health and strength to our very souls. So whether you go to the table and take communion this coming Easter, or whether you commit to making every meal a sacrament by recognizing Jesus as the only true sacrament, and by living a sacramental life, don't ever forget what Jesus was doing on that Passover night. He redefines this meal forever, and he wants it to redefine our lives forever. He wants it to redefine the way we live our lives forever, because he says, "This is my covenant. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to do for you." I'm going to ask that we sing together that beautiful song of Albert Osborne. Just 3 verses. And I want us to use that as our time of reflection this morning. I want you to think about what the general is saying. Think about it in the context of what we've said Jesus was trying to do on that Passover night. And ask yourself, is my life Christ's broken bread? Is my love His outpoured wine? Am I a place that people can come to be refreshed and fed? Is my life the kind of life that is sacramental to the point where other souls are refreshed and fed through mine? Is my life the kind of life, my living the kind of sacramental living that other people can actually see Jesus in me? Pray the words as you sing them together, please.